Brooklyn Hayes had been surviving on her own for 72 hours in hostile territory when she heard the faint voices calling for help. The missing soldiers, she discovered, were barely alive, and she was the only person within 50 miles who could keep them that way. At 21 years old, Brooklyn stood barely 5'3" tall, with dark hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to hold secrets from a childhood spent in places most people would never survive. Born and raised in the remote wilderness of northern Alaska, she had learned to live off the land in conditions so harsh that a single mistake could mean death within hours. Her father, a subsistence hunter and trapper, had taught her that survival wasn't about fighting against nature, but about understanding it well enough to become part of it. "The land will provide everything you need," he used to say, "but only if you're smart enough to recognize what it's offering and humble enough to accept it on its own terms." Those lessons had kept Brooklyn alive during countless wilderness expeditions throughout her childhood, when she routinely spent weeks alone in terrain that would challenge experienced survival experts. She had learned to find food where others saw emptiness, to create shelter from materials that seemed inadequate, and to navigate through storms that could disorient and kill even experienced outdoorsmen. But Brooklyn's path to the Army had been unconventional and painful. The economic collapse of her small Alaskan community had forced her family to leave the wilderness they had called home for generations. Her father's traditional skills provided little income in the modern economy, and the family had struggled to adapt to life in urban environments that felt alien and hostile. When Brooklyn turned 18, military service had seemed like the only viable option for someone with her background and limited formal education. The recruiter had been impressed by her wilderness experience and physical fitness, but had struggled to find an appropriate military occupational specialty that would utilize her unique capability. Brooklyn had been assigned to infantry training, a decision that seemed logical given her outdoor experience but that proved problematic almost immediately. The structured environment of military training was completely foreign to someone who had grown up with the freedom and self-reliance that wilderness life demanded. More challenging was the social environment of military training, where Brooklyn's quiet demeanor and unconventional background made her an outsider among recruits who had grown up in more traditional American communities. Her fellow soldiers viewed her silence as unfriendliness and her wilderness skills as irrelevant to modern military operation. The training itself had been frustrating for Brooklyn, not because it was physically demanding, but because it emphasized teamwork and following orders in situations where her instincts told her that individual initiative and adaptation would be more effective. She struggled with the rigidity of military procedures when her experience suggested that flexibility and improvisation were essential for survival. By the time Brooklyn completed basic training, she had earned a reputation as a competent but unremarkable soldier who followed orders without enthusiasm and rarely volunteered for additional responsibility. Her instructors noted her physical capabilities and wilderness experience in their evaluations, but expressed doubts about her leadership potential and her commitment to military service. The deployment to Afghanistan had been Brooklyn's first overseas assignment, and the environment had initially seemed more familiar than the military bases where she had trained. The mountains and harsh conditions reminded her of Alaska, but the constant presence of other soldiers and the emphasis on teamwork continued to make her feel like an outsider. Brooklyn had been assigned to Forward Operating Base Granite, a remote outpost in eastern Afghanistan that served as a staging area for patrols and reconnaissance missions throughout the region. The base housed approximately 150 soldiers and was known for the challenging terrain and hostile conditions that made operations extremely dangerous. For 3 months, Brooklyn had performed her assigned duties with quiet competence, while remaining largely invisible to her fellow soldiers and superiors. She pulled guard duty, maintained equipment, and participated in training exercises without distinguishing herself or attracting attention. To most people at FOB Granite, she was just another soldier fulfilling her obligations without particular distinction. What nobody knew was that Brooklyn had been using her off-duty time to explore the mountains around the base, learning the terrain and developing an understanding of the local environment that exceeded that of soldiers who had been deployed to the region for years. Her wilderness instincts had adapted quickly to the Afghan landscape, and she had identified water sources, shelter locations, and navigation routes that weren't documented in any military map. Brooklyn's transformation from invisible soldier to essential asset began when Patrol Bravo failed to return from a routine reconnaissance mission in the mountains northeast of FOB Granite. The six-man patrol had been tasked with observing enemy movement patterns in a valley that intelligence suggested was being used as a supply route for Taliban forces. The patrol's last communication had been a routine check-in indicating that they had reached their observation position and were beginning surveillance operations. When they failed to report in at their scheduled communication times, concern had grown gradually into alarm as hours passed without contact. Search and rescue operations had been hampered by weather conditions that grounded helicopters and made ground movement extremely dangerous. Heavy snow and high winds had moved into the area, creating conditions that limited visibility and made navigation treacherous even for experienced mountain operators. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Martinez, the FOB Granite commander, had assembled her senior staff to discuss search options during a briefing that Brooklyn attended as part of the base's general personnel. The discussion painted a grim picture of soldiers who were missing in terrain that offered countless hiding places but few opportunities for rescue. "The weather window is closing rapidly," Colonel Martinez announced to the assembled soldiers. "We have perhaps 12 hours before conditions become impossible for ground search operations. After that, we're looking at waiting for the storm to pass, which could be days." Master Sergeant Robert Chen, the base's senior NCO, had outlined the challenges facing any search mission. "Ma'am, the area where Bravo team was operating covers approximately 20 square kilometers of mountainous terrain, with numerous ravines, caves, and rock formations where they could be sheltered. Even with full search teams, finding them before the weather deteriorates further would be extremely difficult." Brooklyn had listened to the discussion with growing recognition that conventional search methods were unlikely to succeed in the time available. The terrain being described was similar to areas where she had spent countless hours as a child, and she understood that finding people in such conditions required skills that went beyond standard military training. As the briefing continued, Brooklyn realized that she might possess capabilities that could make the difference between successful rescue and leaving American soldiers to die in the mountains. But volunteering would mean revealing skills that weren't in her personnel file and taking on responsibilities that could result in her own death if she had overestimated her abilities. After the briefing ended, Brooklyn approached Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez, her squad leader, with information that would surprise everyone who thought they knew her capabilities. "Sergeant," Brooklyn said quietly, "I think I might be able to help with the search mission." Rodriguez looked at Brooklyn with the patience he typically reserved for soldiers who didn't understand the complexities of combat operations. "Hayes, this isn't a training exercise. We're talking about finding people in some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan during a winter storm. I understand the risks, Sergeant, but I also understand this kind of terrain and these kinds of conditions. I've been operating in similar environments since I was a child." Rodriguez studied Brooklyn's face, looking for any sign of bravado or unrealistic confidence that might indicate she was underestimating the mission's danger. What he saw instead was the same quiet competence she had displayed in her regular duties, combined with a confidence that suggested capabilities he hadn't previously recognized. "Hayes, what exactly are you proposing?" Brooklyn had been thinking about this conversation for hours, developing ideas about how her wilderness skills could be applied to search and rescue operations in Afghan mountain terrain. "Sergeant, I'm proposing a solo search mission, using navigation and survival techniques that might allow me to cover more ground and operate in conditions that would stop larger search teams." The suggestion was so far outside standard military doctrine that Rodriguez initially dismissed it entirely. Solo operations in hostile territory were extremely dangerous under the best circumstances, and sending a relatively inexperienced soldier on such a mission seemed like professional negligence. But as Rodriguez considered the alternatives, he began to understand that Brooklyn might be proposing the only viable option for finding Patrol Bravo before the weather made rescue impossible. Conventional search methods had already proven inadequate, and time was running out for soldiers who might be injured and exposed to life-threatening conditions. "Hayes, if you're serious about this, you need to understand that we're talking about operating alone in hostile territory during a winter storm with no backup and no support. If something goes wrong, there's no extraction plan that doesn't involve significant risk to additional personnel. Brooklyn's response reflected the calm confidence she had inherited from her father and developed through years of wilderness experience. "Sergeant, I've spent weeks alone in terrain that could kill me just as quickly as enemy soldiers or mountain storm. The difference is that I know how to read the signs that tell me when conditions are becoming dangerous and how to find shelter and resources when conventional approaches fail." Rodriguez made a decision that would either validate Brooklyn's confidence or result in losing another soldier in the mountains. "Hayes, I'm going to give you the chance to brief your plan to Colonel Martinez, but if she approves this mission, you'd better be able to deliver on everything you're claiming." The briefing that followed was unlike any Brooklyn had ever given. Standing before the FOB Granite senior staff, she outlined an approach to search and rescue that combined military objectives with techniques borrowed from subsistence hunting, wilderness navigation, and survival skills that most of the officers had never encountered in their professional experience. Brooklyn's plan called for insertion at a point approximately 5 kilometers from Patrol Bravo's last known position, followed by a systematic search that would take advantage of natural terrain features and weather patterns to locate signs of the missing soldier. She would use wilderness tracking techniques to identify human passage through the landscape, and would employ survival skills to operate effectively in conditions that would challenge conventional search methods. Colonel Martinez's initial reaction was skeptical, but as Brooklyn answered detailed questions about her approach, the commander began to understand that this unconventional plan might succeed where traditional methods had failed. "Hayes, your approach is definitely outside standard doctrine, but our standard approaches aren't finding our missing soldiers. The question is whether you can actually perform at the level you're describing." Brooklyn's answer was straightforward and honest. "Ma'am, I can't guarantee that I'll find them, but I can guarantee that I'll cover more ground and operate in worse conditions than conventional search teams. Sometimes that's enough to make the difference." The mission approval process was expedited due to the time-critical nature of the situation and the deteriorating weather conditions that threatened to make any rescue attempt impossible. Brooklyn would have 24 hours to locate Patrol Bravo and either facilitate their rescue or provide intelligence that would guide subsequent search operations. The preparation phase for Brooklyn's mission was intense but necessarily brief due to the urgency of the situation. Rather than focusing on standard search and rescue equipment, she selected gear that would support her wilderness-based approach while allowing her to operate effectively in mountain conditions during a storm. Brooklyn's equipment load was carefully selected to balance capability with mobility. She carried minimal electronics due to the weather conditions that would affect their reliability, instead relying on compass navigation and natural landmark identification that would function regardless of technological failures. Most importantly, Brooklyn spent her preparation time studying maps and weather reports to understand the terrain features and environmental conditions that would affect both her search operations and the survival of the missing soldier. She identified areas where injured personnel might seek shelter and routes that wounded soldiers might use if they were attempting to return to base. As Brooklyn prepared for insertion, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the wilderness of Alaska to the mountains of Afghanistan. The skills her father had taught her for surviving in harsh conditions were about to be tested in circumstances where failure would mean the death of American soldiers who were depending on her ability. The helicopter insertion took place during deteriorating weather conditions that pushed the aircraft and crew to their operational limit. Brooklyn was inserted at a landing zone approximately 6 kilometers from Patrol Bravo's last known position, far enough from potential enemy activity to avoid immediate threat, but close enough to allow her to reach the search area before weather conditions became impossible. As the helicopter departed and Brooklyn found herself alone in the Afghan mountains during a winter storm, she felt the familiar calm that had always accompanied her wilderness expedition. The environment was harsh and potentially deadly, but it was also the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire life. Brooklyn disappeared into the storm-swept mountains like the ghost she was about to become. Over the next 18 hours, she would demonstrate capabilities that would transform understanding of what was possible in terms of wilderness search and rescue operations, using skills that nobody at FOB Granite had fully understood to accomplish what conventional methods had failed to achieve. The missing soldiers who would owe their lives to her efforts were about to discover that salvation could come from the most unexpected sources, delivered by someone whose capabilities had been hidden beneath the surface of military conformity until the moment when they were desperately needed. Brooklyn moved through the mountain terrain with a certainty that would have amazed her fellow soldiers at FOB Granite. The storm that was hampering conventional search operations provided her with advantages that her wilderness training had taught her to recognize and exploit. The snow would preserve tracks and signs of human passage, while the wind patterns would carry sounds and scents that could guide her to the missing soldiers. Her first discovery came within 2 hours of beginning her search. Brooklyn found evidence of recent human passage through a narrow valley that conventional search teams had dismissed as impassable due to the terrain and weather conditions. Boot prints in sheltered areas and disturbed vegetation indicated that at least some members of Patrol Bravo had moved through the area within the past day. The tracks told a story that Brooklyn could read like text. The spacing and depth of the prints indicated that the soldiers were moving slowly and carefully, suggesting injuries or equipment problems that were affecting their mobility. More concerning were signs that the group had split up, with different sets of tracks heading in divergent directions. Brooklyn made the tactical decision to follow the larger group of tracks, reasoning that wounded soldiers would likely stay together for mutual support, while those who were mobile might attempt to seek help. The trail led her through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers under normal conditions, but that was manageable for someone with Brooklyn's background and skills. As she followed the tracks through increasingly difficult terrain, Brooklyn began to understand what had happened to Patrol Bravo. The evidence suggested that they had encountered enemy forces and had been forced to abandon their observation position under fire. The retreat had taken them into terrain that offered concealment but that also separated them from their planned extraction route. The trail led Brooklyn to a rock formation that provided natural shelter from the wind and snow. As she approached the area, she could hear faint voices that confirmed her tracking had been successful. But what she found when she reached the shelter location was worse than she had anticipated. 4 members of Patrol Bravo were huddled in a makeshift shelter constructed from equipment and natural materials. 3 of the soldiers were clearly suffering from exposure and exhaustion, while the 4th appeared to have sustained injuries that required immediate medical attention. All 4 were in serious condition and would not survive another night in the mountains without intervention. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the patrol leader, looked up as Brooklyn approached their shelter. His expression was a mixture of relief and disbelief as he recognized her uniform and realized that rescue had arrived. "Hayes, how did you find us? We've been trying to signal for help, but the weather has been jamming our communication." Brooklyn quickly assessed the tactical and medical situation while providing the reassurance that the soldiers desperately needed. "Sergeant Torres, I tracked you from your last known position. Help is coming, but first I need to know about your other team members and get you stabilized for extraction." Torres explained that Patrol Bravo had been engaged by enemy forces while conducting surveillance operations. During the retreat, 2 team members had become separated from the main group and were missing somewhere in the surrounding terrain. The 4 soldiers with Torres had been moving toward what they hoped was the direction of the base, but had become lost in the storm and were no longer certain of their location. Brooklyn's wilderness training immediately identified the challenges facing the rescue operation. The missing soldiers would need to be located and the injured team members would require medical stabilization before extraction could be attempted. The weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, limiting the time available for complex rescue operations. "Sergeant, I need to find your missing people and get you prepared for evacuation. The weather window is closing fast, and we need to move everyone to a location where helicopters can reach us." Brooklyn began the most challenging phase of her mission, locating 2 missing soldiers in terrain that offered countless hiding places while providing medical care for soldiers who were suffering from exposure and combat injuries. Her wilderness background had prepared her for exactly these kinds of multifaceted emergency situations. She spent the next hour stabilizing the 4 soldiers she had found, using techniques learned during countless wilderness emergencies in Alaska. Brooklyn shared her food and water, helped improve their shelter using materials she had brought and resources available in the environment, and provided first aid for injuries that conventional military training might not have addressed adequately. But Brooklyn's most important contribution was the confidence and competence she brought to a situation where the soldiers had begun to fear they would not survive. Her calm demeanor and obvious expertise in wilderness conditions provided psychological support that was as important as the physical assistance she offered. "Hayes," Torres said as Brooklyn worked to treat his injured teammate, "I don't understand how you found us or how you're operating so effectively in these conditions. This is some of the most challenging terrain and weather I've ever encountered." Brooklyn's response reflected the matter-of-fact approach she had learned from her father. "Sergeant, I grew up in Alaska where conditions like this were normal. You learn to read the signs that tell you where people might go and how to follow tracks even when they're not obvious." As Brooklyn worked to stabilize the 4 soldiers, she was also planning her search for the 2 missing team members. The tracks she had followed to this location continued beyond the shelter, suggesting that the separated soldiers had attempted to continue moving toward what they believed was safety. Brooklyn made the difficult decision to leave the 4 stabilized soldiers temporarily while she searched for their missing teammates. She provided them with additional supplies and improved their shelter to ensure they could survive until her return. But she understood that time was running out for soldiers who might be exposed to the full force of the storm. The search for the missing soldiers took Brooklyn through terrain that tested every skill she had developed during her wilderness training. The tracks were fading rapidly due to the continuing snowfall, and the wind was eliminating scent trails that might have helped guide her search. But Brooklyn's understanding of how people move through mountain terrain when they are lost and injured allowed her to predict where the missing soldiers might have gone. She identified natural shelter locations and logical routes that frightened people might choose when trying to find safety. Her persistence was rewarded when she heard faint calls for help coming from a ravine approximately 800 meters from the main group's location. The 2 missing soldiers had fallen into a natural depression that provided shelter from the wind but that also trapped them in a location where they couldn't climb out without assistance. Private First Class Jennifer Kim and Specialist Robert Davis were both suffering from severe exposure and exhaustion when Brooklyn reached their position. Kim had sustained a leg injury during the fall that prevented her from climbing, while Davis was showing signs of hypothermia that indicated his condition was becoming life-threatening. Brooklyn immediately began emergency treatment while assessing options for extracting the soldiers from their trapped position. The ravine was too deep and steep for the injured soldiers to climb out without assistance, but it also provided protection from the storm that might be their best survival option until rescue could be organized. "Kim Davis, I'm going to get you out of here, but first I need to warm you up and treat your injuries. Then we're going to figure out how to get you back to the rest of your team." Brooklyn's approach to the rescue reflected the problem-solving skills she had learned during countless wilderness emergencies. She used rope and climbing techniques to create an extraction system that would allow her to lift the injured soldiers out of the ravine, while also providing medical care that would stabilize them for the evacuation. The extraction process required several hours of careful work in deteriorating weather conditions. Brooklyn had to manage the technical challenges of the rescue, while also providing medical care and psychological support for soldiers who were injured, exhausted, and suffering from exposure. When she finally succeeded in extracting Kim and Davis from the ravine, Brooklyn faced the challenge of moving 2 injured soldiers through difficult terrain to rejoin the rest of Patrol Bravo. The weather was continuing to worsen, and time was running out for evacuation operation. Brooklyn's solution was to create an improvised travois using equipment and natural materials that would allow her to transport the injured soldiers across terrain that would otherwise be impassable. Her wilderness training had included construction techniques for emergency equipment, and she adapted those skills to military requirements. The movement back to the main group's location tested Brooklyn's physical endurance and navigation skills as she guided 6 soldiers through mountain terrain during a storm that was pushing weather conditions to extreme levels. But her confidence and competence provided the leadership that kept the group together and moving towards safety. When Brooklyn finally reunited all 6 members of Patrol Bravo at a location suitable for helicopter extraction, she had completed one of the most challenging search and rescue missions in recent military history. Her wilderness skills had saved American lives in circumstances where conventional approaches had failed. The helicopter extraction took place during a brief break in the storm that provided just enough visibility for the aircraft to locate the soldiers and complete the rescue. As Patrol Bravo was loaded onto the helicopter, every member understood that their survival had depended on capabilities that none of them had known existed within their unit. Staff Sergeant Torres spoke for his entire team when he told Brooklyn, "Hayes, what you did out there was nothing short of miraculous. You found us when we were lost, kept us alive when we were dying, and got us home when we thought we'd never see the base again." Brooklyn's response was characteristically modest. "Sergeant, I just used the skills I had to help soldiers who needed help. That's what we're supposed to do for each other." But everyone involved understood that what Brooklyn had accomplished went far beyond normal expectations. She had demonstrated capabilities that would influence search and rescue doctrine and establish her as a soldier whose skills were essential to operations in challenging environments. The debriefing that followed Brooklyn's successful rescue mission revealed the full scope of her achievements and the techniques she had used to accomplish what others had thought impossible. Her methods would be studied and incorporated into training programs, while her reputation would attract attention from special operations units throughout the military. Brooklyn Hayes had transformed from invisible soldier to essential asset in a single mission, proving that the most valuable capabilities were often those that remained hidden until the moment when they were desperately needed. The silent savior had emerged from obscurity to demonstrate that heroism could take many forms and could come from the most unexpected sources. The rescue mission that established Brooklyn's reputation had immediate and far-reaching consequences throughout the military community. Within hours of Patrol Bravo's safe return to FOB Granite, reports of Brooklyn's performance were circulating through command structures that recognized the significance of what she had accomplished. Colonel Martinez's after-action report documented not just the successful rescue, but the revolutionary approach Brooklyn had used to locate and extract the missing soldier. The report noted that conventional search methods had failed to make progress in conditions where Brooklyn had operated with apparent ease, suggesting that her techniques represented capabilities that needed to be understood and developed. Major General David Patterson, the regional commander responsible for operations throughout eastern Afghanistan, personally reviewed Brooklyn's mission reports and requested detailed information about her background and method. The general understood that Brooklyn represented something genuinely new in military capabilities, a soldier whose civilian skills had been adapted to accomplish missions that exceeded the capability of conventional training. "Hayes," Colonel Martinez said during Brooklyn's debriefing, "what you accomplished during that rescue mission is unprecedented in my experience. You located 6 missing soldiers in terrain and conditions that had defeated our best search teams, and you kept them alive using techniques that aren't taught in any military school." Brooklyn maintained her characteristic modesty despite the recognition she was receiving. "Ma'am, I just used the skills my father taught me growing up in Alaska. The terrain was different, but the principles of wilderness survival and tracking remained the same regardless of location." But Colonel Martinez understood that Brooklyn was minimizing achievements that could revolutionize search and rescue operations. "Hayes, your principles enabled you to accomplish what multiple search teams with sophisticated equipment couldn't achieve. We need to understand how to develop these capabilities in other soldiers." The conversation that followed would reshape Brooklyn's military career and influence survival training programs for years to come. Colonel Martinez offered Brooklyn assignment to a newly created position that would utilize her unique skills while developing training programs to pass her knowledge to other soldiers. Brooklyn's new role would involve participating in the most challenging search and rescue missions while simultaneously serving as an instructor for soldiers who showed potential for wilderness operations. She would help create a new specialty within the military that combined traditional survival training with advanced techniques borrowed from subsistence hunting and wilderness living. The training programs that Brooklyn developed drew heavily on her civilian experience with wilderness survival, adapting those techniques to military requirements while maintaining the emphasis on self-reliance and environmental awareness that made them effective. Her approach proved particularly valuable for soldiers who would be operating in remote areas where conventional support might not be available. Within 6 months of her rescue mission, Brooklyn had trained over 100 military personnel in advanced wilderness survival and tracking techniques. Her students included soldiers from all branches of service who had been selected for training based on assignments that would require them to operate in challenging environments. The success of these training programs led to Brooklyn's promotion to sergeant and her assignment as the lead instructor for a specialized survival school that would prepare soldiers for operations in environments where conventional training was inadequate. The school became a model for how military training could incorporate civilian expertise to enhance operational capabilities. But perhaps the most significant impact of Brooklyn's story was its effect on military culture regarding the recognition and utilization of non-traditional skills. Her transformation from overlooked soldier to essential specialist demonstrated that talent could emerge from unexpected backgrounds and that organizational success depended on creating systems that could identify and develop that talent effectively. The rescue mission that had established Brooklyn's reputation also influenced search and rescue procedures throughout the region. Enemy forces had learned that American soldiers possessed capabilities they hadn't previously encountered, leading to changes in their own operational procedures and defensive arrangements. More importantly, Brooklyn's success had provided coalition forces with confidence that soldiers could be recovered even from the most challenging circumstances. Several planned missions that had been considered too dangerous due to the remote terrain and harsh conditions were approved based on the understanding that specialized rescue capabilities were available if needed. As Brooklyn's career progressed into increasingly specialized assignments, she continued to refine and develop the techniques that had made her successful. Each mission added to her experience and reputation while providing opportunities to test new approaches and equipment against different types of challenges and environments. One particularly demanding assignment took Brooklyn to a jungle environment where coalition personnel had been lost during a helicopter crash in terrain that conventional search methods couldn't penetrate. The mission required her to adapt her wilderness techniques to tropical conditions, while operating in an environment where enemy forces were actively hunting for the same survivor. Brooklyn's approach to the jungle rescue mission utilized techniques adapted from Arctic survival and mountaineering, combined with her proven methods for tracking and navigation in hostile territory. The mission required her to operate in conditions that included extreme heat, limited visibility, and terrain that offered both excellent concealment and deadly obstacles. The jungle mission proved even more challenging than her mountain rescue, requiring Brooklyn to adapt her techniques to conditions that included dangerous wildlife, tropical diseases, and vegetation so dense that movement was measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. But her wilderness background had prepared her for exactly these kinds of environmental challenges. Brooklyn's success in jungle operations further enhanced her reputation and led to additional specialized assignments that tested her capabilities in various environments and scenarios. She became the operator that commanders requested when conventional approaches had failed and when mission success depended on capabilities that exceeded normal military training. Throughout her career advancement, Brooklyn maintained contact with the soldiers she had rescued during her first mission. Patrol Bravo had returned to successful operations and several team members had requested assignment to units where they could continue working with soldiers who possessed Brooklyn's specialized capability. Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been promoted following his rescue, often spoke about Brooklyn's performance to other soldiers and commanders. "Hayes didn't just save our lives," he would explain. "She demonstrated that there are capabilities within our own personnel that we didn't know existed. That kind of knowledge could change how we approach every mission." The recognition that Brooklyn had received had also attracted attention from civilian search and rescue organizations that were interested in her techniques and experience. Several agencies had requested consultation on operations that required the kind of wilderness expertise that Brooklyn had demonstrated, creating opportunities for her to contribute to civilian emergency response capability. 5 years after her first rescue mission, Brooklyn found herself leading a team of specialized operators on assignments that would have been impossible without the techniques she had developed. Her transformation from individual operator to team leader represented the natural evolution of capabilities that had proven their value in the most demanding circumstances. As Brooklyn reflected on her journey from the wilderness of Alaska to the leadership of specialized military teams, She understood that her success had been built on the foundation of skills her father had taught her as a child. The ability to read natural signs and survive in harsh conditions had proven valuable whether she was hunting caribou or rescuing soldiers. But the most important lesson from Brooklyn's story was that excellence was transferable between different environments and applications when it was based on fundamental principles like observation, patience, and respect for the natural world. The specific techniques might vary, but the underlying approach that produced success remained consistent. Brooklyn Hayes had become proof that the most effective soldiers were often those who could combine specialized civilian skills with military training to create capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. The silent savior had emerged from obscurity to demonstrate that innovation and excellence could come from the most unexpected sources and could be applied to achieve results that nobody had thought possible. The legacy of her unconventional approach would continue to influence military training and operations long after her individual missions were completed, ensuring that future soldiers would have access to techniques that had been proven effective in the most challenging circumstances. Brooklyn had shown that sometimes the best solutions came not from following established procedures, but from understanding fundamental principles well enough to apply them in new and creative ways. Her story had become part of military legend, told to new soldiers as an example of how hidden capabilities could emerge when they were most needed, and how individual excellence could make the difference between mission success and tragic failure. The quiet soldier from Alaska had proven that heroism came in many forms, and that the most valuable contributions often came from those who worked without recognition until the moment when their skills became essential to survival.